This is the Angry Birds Bird Minute, sponsored by Angry Birds for their 15th anniversary, where we tell you all about a cool bird that may or may not be angry. Today's bird is the ostrich. Ostriches are the largest living birds, getting up to weights of over 300 pounds. That's around 145 kilograms. They also lay the biggest eggs of any land animal and can run almost twice as fast as Usain Bolt. Ostriches are also goofy dancers. The males will crouch on their ankles and wave their otherwise useless wings around in the air, bobbling their long necks and their little faces back and forth to try to attract a mate. We'll link to a video of the display in this episode's description. But are they angry? On a scale of 1 to angry, ostriches are rearing for drama on the dance floor. This is Wild Green Streams. I'm Rhett.
I'm Io.
And today on the pod, we have Dr. Doug Tallamy of the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He's authored over 112 research publications and taught insect-related courses for 44 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. Dr. Doug Tallamy, welcome to the pod.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, what's going on with biodiversity? Tell us about the biodiversity crisis.
It's not good.
Hence the name crisis.
Yeah, crisis. Yeah, we've got two global crises. We've got climate change, definitely a crisis. But we've got the biodiversity crisis. And if we had no climate change, we would still have the biodiversity crisis. So it's something we can't ignore. It simply means that it's not just a matter of species going extinct. They are. We're in the 6th great extinction event that the planet has ever experienced. It's also about what we call defaunation, where the common species that run our ecosystems are becoming uncommon. They're not extinct, but the populations are no longer strong enough to perform the ecosystem services that they once did. And there's a whole slew of them. We've lost 3 billion breeding birds in this country in the last 50 years. None of those bird species are extinct, but that's 3 billion fewer than that's a third of our North American bird population gone. We've got global insect decline. The UN is predicting we are going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years, which, by the way, is not an option because those are the species that keep us alive on this planet. So it is a real crisis. It's one that we have to acknowledge and get to work on. The good news is it's not that hard to turn around. It's much easier to solve the biodiversity crisis than it is to solve the climate change crisis.
Most people probably think of biodiversity crisis going hand in hand with climate change, but you say that they are two different things. And so, working on one would help the other. But how do they differ?
They are two different things, but the solutions to climate change often help biodiversity at the same time. So, for example, we've got to pull carbon out of the air. Okay, carbon dioxide is one of the major causes of the problem. We put it there through fossil fuels. But a third of the carbon that's in the atmosphere right now has come from us chopping down our forests, our trees, our plants. That carbon's all up in the atmosphere now. If we put those forests and trees and plants back, we'd pull a third of the carbon out of the atmosphere. That would help a whole bunch. So there's the Trillion Tree Project, and a lot of cities have million tree plans where we're planting trees, and that's good. If we plant the right trees, if we put the right plants back, if we convert lawn, which does not sequester carbon, into anything else, we're helping climate change, and we're also helping the biodiversity crisis because biodiversity starts with plants.
There's two different angles that I see people going when they are stuck kind of in a rut on either of these issues. From one end, they think, what can I do? And no matter who you are, because any human is small compared to the whole world, they'll look at what they can do and say, that's only a partial incremental change. They'll say, like, for example, you mentioned planting trees. It seems like it's almost trendy for people to write about how planting trees will not solve all of climate change or all of the biodiversity loss. Even though that's never the stated goal of people who are trying to plant trees, it's always a partial solution to a complicated problem. On the other hand, when you list these gigantic numbers, a trillion trees, or you say however many gazillion gigatons of carbon we have to pull out of the atmosphere, or whatever, people will say that is so big we could not even come close to solving that problem. That's just so far outside the scope of what a person can do. So it's almost like both from the macro and the micro, there's this almost like a learned helplessness I see people do. And when I look at your work and when I read some of your books, I see some arguments that I think are interesting to politely and gently push back on those kind of depressing ideas and mindsets. And I was wondering what you think about that and how you would respond to those kind of sentiments.
Well, we're not asking any single person to solve climate change or any single person to solve the biodiversity crisis. I am asking them to rethink the way they have landscaped their yard, because if they do that, they're contributing to climate change solutions, and they're also regenerating biodiversity right where they live, and they can see that. So is it going to save all the species on the planet? No, but it can save a lot of species right where you live. It can reboost their population. You can generate lots of caterpillars so you can have breeding birds again. You can support diverse pollinator populations so that you're pollinating lots of plants. I emphasize to people not to think about the entire planet, because obviously that you just get depressed doing that. Just think about the piece of that planet, the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, that's where you start. And you can do a lot to your property, see the results, feel good about it, and contribute to the overall solutions. And of course, we're trying to get everybody to do this, and then it really will make a difference. But you're only in charge of you. So, do what your responsibility is. If we're going to claim to own a piece of the earth, our responsibility is to take care of that piece. And it's our responsibility for our own good. We all depend on nature. We all depend on functional ecosystems. Every one of us, whether you're a tree hugger, whether you like nature or not. And that means everybody has a responsibility to help sustain it. So again, if you own a piece of the earth, you've got to treat that piece in a way that sustains life right where you live, and then that will help improve the quality of your local ecosystem, rather than right now most people's yards are degrading it. And it also makes the problems that something that's manageable. It's something that you can deal with. We'll probably talk about it in a few minutes, but there's a whole bunch of things one person can do in their yard and have measurable differences in a positive way.
I can't remember where it was that I heard it, but it was in talking about some kind of large scale issues that if you think about the whole scope of them, you think I can't change it. And I can't remember the exact wording of the person who said it, but it was something along the lines of the helplessness sets in when you think of things beyond your scope of capability. One person can't solve the entire world of climate change. So you're like, oh man, I can't do anything. But if you think about your scope, if it's just your yard, where you're like, I can make a change right here, and actually I can make a lot of change right here. And if you just work within your scope, then you don't feel hopeless about it. And also that's how you can actively make change. Because if you can't, not to say that you shouldn't worry about other things going on, but you don't have to spend all your time lamenting that you can't change the big picture when, you have to you can change the little picture, and that, the big picture is made up of small pictures. So I find that helpful when talking about kind of these larger issues, and people say I don't know what I can, I can't do anything. It's well, you could do something small, and that's better than nothing.
Somebody recently said, and unfortunately I can't remember who John Bray, something like that. Don't quote me. But he said, the biggest threat to the planet is thinking that somebody else will save it. And I thought that was right on.
Your primary area of study is insects. And how has that connected into and led to this emphasis on yards and people's personal stewardship of their properties?
Well, insects are the little things that run the world. That's a quote from E.O. Wilson back in 1987. And he said, if we lost our insects, we'd lose the pollinators, which is they're pollinating 90% of our flowering plants. We'd lose our decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients. We would lose all the insects that fuel the food web. So we'd lose the vertebrate animals. our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals. They'd all be gone if we lost insects. So yeah, I study insects. I didn't know that when I chose that, but it turns out they are really important. So how do you keep insects on your property? Well, it starts with what we call the first trophic level, and that is plants. They're capturing energy from the sun. They're turning it into food through photosynthesis. So they turn that energy into simple sugars and carbohydrates, and that is the food that supports just about all the life on planet Earth. Only if you get that food from the plant to the animals. If you don't do that, you don't have any animals. And if you don't have animals, you don't have a functional ecosystem. And it turns out that most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that eat plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and most of the insects that they're eating are caterpillars. So it turns out caterpillars are enormously important in transferring energy from plants to other animals. And that will happen either really well or really poorly, depending on the plants you choose for your yard. So right now we've got 44 million acres of lawn out there, and if you have a lawn the way you're supposed to have a lawn, it's not supporting anything. It's not sequestering any carbon. It's wrecking our watershed. No pollinators, no food web. So reducing the lawn on your property and putting in the plants that do support those insects, that support the food web, is the most important thing that you can do. And it's important to remember, you don't have to do it in one day. It can be a 10-year goal, a 20-year goal. Plant one tree each year, put a nice bed underneath it so that caterpillars that are in that tree drop to the ground and have a place to pupate. That reduces the lawn right there. Change your light bulbs. The outdoor lights right now, if they're white, they're killing insects every night. If they're yellow, they don't even attract insects. It's a very simple thing you can do to help the global insect decline. No more mosquito fogging or any other pesticide. That does not control mosquitoes, and it does kill the monarch and all of our pollinators, and we don't need to do that. So there's all kinds of really simple things that we can do to create a functional ecosystem right at home.
And what are your things of saying, like, it doesn't have to happen overnight? One of the things that I know, and I'm looking into for my own space to getting in more native plants, which we'll get into your website later, very helpful for that. And I was thinking for a while, I was like, I have to get the perfect plants first. I have to get all of them. I have to know how I'm going to arrange them. I have to know how I'm going to plant them. I got to know what's the best season. And then I was like, well, I don't have to do all of that first. I can just start with one and figure out, okay, it likes the sun here, or it likes the sun better here, and move it around. And it can be a learning process as you go on. You don't have to be an expert to start. The whole point of starting something new is that you're not an expert, but I know myself and many other people want to either do it 100% right and not at all, but really it doesn't have to be 100% right. You can just do little bits here and there, and then eventually it will grow.
Yeah, I do encourage people to start slowly, and I would say plant one tree, and I would make it an oak tree because they are the most important plant you can put on your property, and make it a small oak tree. You can start with an acorn, making it free, but that tree will grow. I planted acorns on my property 23 years ago. They're now pushing 70 feet tall. So they're real trees, and they've been real trees for a long time. It didn't take that long. But where you put that tree, how many trees you have, and all the other things you just talked about, those are landscape design questions. And it depends on where you are. It depends on whether you want to enter a design contest, because a lot of people do. Then you can hire a landscape designer, and they'll help you with all those issues. They're trained to do that. I live on a flag lot where nobody can see our yard. So it kind of frees me up. I'm not entering contests. We have a restoration, not a native plant garden. And many of the things that were planted here were planted by the blue jays. They were planted by the squirrels. We let nature kind of do it. So it's not going to win a design contest, but it really is functional. So that's one way to do it.
What is the vision of Homegrown National Park?
Homegrown National Park is a small nonprofit that we started, it must be almost 4 years now ago. The object was to reach the people who don't understand what their responsibility to good earth stewardship is. I talk to people all the time, giving talks all the time. But it's always, we call it the choir. It's the choir who invites me. They already know that this is important. They're already excited about it. And we talk and we have a great time. But it doesn't expand, it doesn't solve that knowledge gap that we have out there. So how do we reach the non-choir? That's why we established, Michelle Alfandari and I started Homegrown National Park with the idea of getting these messages to the 330 million people in the U.S. that don't have a clue that we have a biodiversity crisis and that they can play a part in solving it. So our mission is to regenerate biodiversity on our human-dominated landscapes in the way that you regenerate biodiversity. You do it with native plants. You remove the non-natives that don't support biodiversity. And over time, we develop a community that is sympathetic to the needs of conservation. So one of our main goals is to actually work on changing the culture. We've got an adversarial relationship with nature right now, and that's got to be a collaborative one because we can't live without nature. It's just like we can't live without insects, we can't live without nature. We got to stop killing both of those, or we're going to pay for it. So people, we have found them very receptive once they hear the arguments and understand what the consequences of not doing these things are. So that's what Homegrown National Park is all about. It uses social media. We've got what we call the biodiversity map, where you register your property on the map, so the location of the property and the amount of area that you're pledging to be a good steward of. So maybe you really are going to reduce your lawn. Maybe you really are going to plant that oak tree. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. It doesn't matter whether it's really modest or not. And then your little piece of your county will light up, and you get to see how many other people in your county have joined Homegrown National Park. And of course, the object is to get the whole country to light up. So that's what we're pushing for. Canada is now part of our system. We're talking to Great Britain to actually jump the pond there and start it in Europe. But we're small. And the important thing is we don't charge. This is free. So we're only as effective as the number of people we can hire, which is very small because it's all based on donations. But we have big ideas, and so far so good.
The name itself comes from almost like a visualization of scale, because I know 40 million acres, I know that's a lot. That's the area of lawn in the United States. But you have a good way of summing it up by counting the different national parks that could fit within that area.
Just fit within half of that area. So if I say, let's cut that area in half, that gives us 20 million acres, which is bigger than Yosemite and Yellowstone and Glacier National Park and Badlands National Park and Mount Rainier and the Adirondacks and the Great Smoky Mountains. All those, you add them all up, it's still less than 20 million acres, which would mean Homegrown National Park would be the biggest park in the country if we actually develop all of that land.
That's really cool. And I like that it makes it feel so much more accessible in a way, because sometimes, and also people being a part of nature, a lot of times people feel very removed from nature, either if you're, in a not as developed area and, you're like, you think, Yosemite is so far away, I'm never going to go see it, I'm never going to be able to be part of it, I can't really do anything. But really, we are a part of nature, and people have been changing the landscape for as long as we've been around. So it's like, it's well within our capabilities to change it for the better, because we've done it before and we can do it again. And I like that it's not Homegrown National Parks, it's Homegrown National Park. So it's like right. Everyone part of one park together. And I really like that like community spirit in our national parks are wonderful things, but there were 375 million people there last year in those parks. So when you go to those parks, that's the first thing you see is a whole bunch of crowds. You can enjoy nature the way you create it right where you live alone. All you have to do is go outside. You can do it any time of year. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, whether there's a government closure or a pandemic. You have the freedom to interact with nature as much or as little as you want. You maybe even just look out your window. That's the beauty of that. No, you're not going to see the Yellowstone Falls or something like that, but you can see a bluebird, you can see a cardinal, you can see
the parents feed their young. You can see butterflies. You can see all kinds of things that they can really make your day. And research has shown that just 15 minutes interacting with nature like that can lower your blood pressure. It can reduce your stress hormone, your cortisol, which improves your immune system. It improves your ability to learn. It reduces stress. When you reduce stress, you do everything better. So there are real medical benefits to just going out in your yard and chilling out there with the natural things that are around you. You'll be a happier, healthier person for it.
I love that. And so some of the things that people can check out, like you were saying, all this is free and it's all providing information on homegrownnationalpark.org. There is an incredible wealth of information for people. I was just perusing even further before the show, and you have great things about, like, if you want to plant native plants but you don't know what is native in your area, you can go on a map and find out what your region is, and you offer these suggestions for plants and such that you can plants, which is like a great way to start if you don't know where to start.
That is one of the most common questions, is what plants should I use where I live? And you can go to, it's actually a section of the National Wildlife Federation website that you can find on our website called Native Plant Finder. You put in your zip code and the best plants, both woody and herbaceous plants for your county will pop up. So it's a very good place to start. It really solves a huge problem. In the past, people didn't know what to plant. They didn't know what was native, what was non-native. They wanted to do the right thing, but they also didn't want to have to take a college course to figure out how to do it. So yes, we want to make it as easy as possible, and there is a lot of information on the website.
And so for all that you have, an amazing wealth of resources. How did you, and working with other collaborators, how did you begin that connection of reaching out to them and saying, hey, I have this idea, let's work on it together? And because, talking about, climate change is a big problem that not just one person can solve it. Setting up, an organization like this, not just one person can do that. So how was it reaching out to some of these collaborators to begin with and saying, hey, I have this idea, and them going from there?
Well, actually, Michelle Alfanderi gets the credit for that. She had recently retired from a licensing career in Manhattan. She didn't know anything about nature. She was a perfect example of the non-choir. But she retired, and she and her husband moved to Connecticut, a rural place in Connecticut. And they weren't there very long, but I was up there giving a talk, and their neighbor knew about that. So their neighbor said, I want you to come to this talk and hear this guy. So Michelle didn't care, but she was nice to her neighbor. So she went to the talk, and she saw the opportunity. She came up to me right after and said, you're not reaching your target audience. I said, my target audience doesn't invite me. And she said, well, so she said, we need to make a nonprofit, and we need to use social media. We need to do all the things that you're not doing, which is true. And so that we reach that non-choir. So really, Michelle gets all the credit for that. I had come up with the idea of Homegrown National Park. I thought of that, when I learned we had 40 million acres of lawn, I said, well, geez, if we cut that in half, how many national parks could fit in that? That was probably 2009 when I had that idea. But all I did was talk about it. I didn't do anything, So Michelle actually made it happen. So.
And so how has that, you said about 4 years ago when you started, how has it changed your going from idea to reality? How has that change been, and what do you think you hope to achieve more in the future? You said you're working on for the native plants, working on Canada, possibly the UK, but what other sort of aspirations do you have and that you hope that people can achieve through Homegrown National Park?
Well, we want to re-landscape the whole country, but we're gonna start modestly, and that's one of the main regions that we encourage people to get on the map. We say, so that we can see how we're doing. We can see where there's gaps. There's about 40,000 people that have signed up so far. We've got about 100,000 acres being managed in a much more eco-friendly way. So that's not 20 million acres, but it's a start.
100,000 acres. That's insane. That's a big change.
It's a good start, right? And it's just accelerating. So who knows? I'm not sure how far we'll go, but you know what? It really is taking off around the country, and I think it's that people are realizing there is something they can do. They can see the results. They can feel good about it. They can be part of the solution instead of part of the problem, and that's what people need. But we don't need any more depressing statistics. There's enough of them out there. They want to do something that's really going to help, and the fact that you can see it helping right at home is so important. There are lots of things we can do to help climate change too, but we can't see any of the results. It's just too big. Mm-hmm. You can see all the life that oak tree brings to your yard when you plant it, and that encourages us to do it again. Plant a black cherry, plant a willow, plant a birch, plant a pollinator garden. A whole bunch of things you can do.
So a lot of your work focuses on the importance of native plants in landscaping. Could you talk a little bit about that and what the importance of that is versus the non-native or sometimes invasive species?
Well, remember, we're trying to get the energy that plants fix from the sun to animals. Native plants are good at doing that. Non-native plants are poor at doing that. And that's because our native animals, particularly the insects that transfer that energy, have specialized. They've developed all the adaptations necessary to transfer that energy, and they've done it over many, many thousands of years here in the U.S. If we bring in a plant from Asia or from South America or Europe, our insects have not had the chance to do that. It takes a long, long time to develop those adaptations. So let's use the monarch butterfly as an example. Everybody knows it's a specialist on milkweed. If you don't have milkweeds, you don't have monarchs. Why is it specialized only on milkweeds? Well, milkweeds are toxic plants. They've got nasty chemicals in them called cardiac glycosides that keep most insects from eating them. But monarchs have the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds so they can eat cardiac glycosides without dying. Milkweeds also have sticky latex sap that gums up the mouth parts of caterpillars and glues them shut. Well, monarchs have a way of blocking the flow of that sticky latex sap. They snip through the midrib of the vein, and then the latex sap can't move to the end of the leaf. Those are adaptations that allow monarchs to eat milkweeds, but very few other insects have figured that out. So monarchs can eat a plant that's unavailable to most insects, but now they're locked into eating that. They develop the adaptations for milkweeds, but not the adaptations for oaks or for asters or for anything else. So if you take, that's the downside of specialization. If you take the plant that these insects specialized away, you lose that insect. They can't just start eating something else. And 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat the plants on which they have specialized. And none of them have specialized on non-native plants. So,
did you say 90% are host plant specialists?
Yes, 90% are just like the monarch.
That's an incredible fraction.
Well, plants don't want to be eaten. They're all protecting themselves. So to get around all those defenses takes all of that coevolution that happens over. Monarchs have been interacting with milkweeds for many, many millions of years, not just a few thousand. So if we take the milkweeds out of our yard and replace them with hostas, the monarch's not going to be able to start eating hostas, not for a couple, many millions of years, and it probably would never happen at all. So we have to respect the specialized interactions between plants and animals that are already here. Right now, we've chosen our plants based on how pretty they are. We've just treated them as decorations. We have to consider their ecological roles as well. And that's the new challenge in horticulture, is how do we landscape in a way that is pretty, but also ecologically functional? And if I were a horticulturist, I'm not, I'm an entomologist, but if I were, that'd be a fun challenge, it seems to me. It'd be much better than which cultivar can I use this year.
Do y'all have horticulturalists reach out to you?
I talk to them all the time, yeah. Landscape architect, national meetings, and landscape designers. Botanical gardens are reaching out to me all the time. So yeah, they're always in my audience, which is a surprise. I actually thought I'd get a lot of pushback on this.
Yeah, that sounds a little outside the choir because they're so heavily reliant on non-native landscaping right now in general.
It's changing. It's changing, and it's changing faster than I thought it would. It's changing because the public is demanding it. The demand for native plants exceeds the supply now, so that's a business opportunity for nurserymen. Again, it's the public saying, "Hey, I want to do something important here, and I'm going to hire you if you help me, and if you don't help me, I'm going to fire you." I do hear people say, "My landscaper won't do that." And I say, "Well, then fire him. Get somebody who will do that." Because this is the future.
Yeah, I love that.
The dream is to be able to, at the moment I don't really have a ton of land where I am, just a little bit, but the dream is to be able to find a piece of land I have good amount of control over, so I can really put it all the fantasy ideas of, like, I could have a pond for water sources, I could have all the native trees, I could all the different habitats, like there's to be able to restore so much is always the goal. And because I'm like, I know that in this patch of land I can have my capabilities and really make a difference. But even I'm not going to wait until some idealized day in the future. I've been looking at native plants and stuff in my area because I'm also a big entomology fan. I love insects and birds and everything. So I'm like, we got to do my little part to bring them here. Then hopefully the neighbors will be like, "Oh, what do you got over there?" Then you can start a conversation and bring in people that way.
You bring up an important point, though. 82% of us live in cities, and a lot of people do not have a lot of land, or they have no land. All they have is a balcony in an apartment complex. And this is where container gardening comes in. We have a section on our website about the best native plants that do well in containers for each ecoregion of the country. So you can go to that website and pick out those native plants and then have them all over your balcony. If you picture a typical apartment complex, it's a pile of bricks. But if everybody had plants in containers over those, throughout the balconies of that apartment complex, it all of a sudden becomes a really important resource to local pollinators, local bees, the migrating market monarch. They're all very mobile insects, and they will find those plants and use them right in the middle of a city.
I really love the idea of not just looking for biodiversity, but trying to promote abundance. Like, I think that we've kind of forgotten just how many animals there used to be and how much of these kind of things that everybody likes monarchs, everybody likes birds, and how much more we could have of that if we just did a few things that we're essentially already doing, but just did them slightly differently.
Yeah, I remind people that none of us missed the passenger pigeon because it was extinct before any of us were born. But it used to be the most common bird in the world. We typically don't miss the bison or the elk either. They roamed all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. So we have changed the world dramatically, and it has not helped biodiversity. This is called shifting baseline. We tend to think that the way things were when we were kids is normal. That's the way they have always been, the way they always will be. But if we're born into a world that's defaunated, it's normal to us, but it's not normal to the history of life on Earth, and it's also not sustainable. We've got to put these species back.
Well, I think we've lost Io, but I think that's also a good place to leave this conversation. The organization is Homegrown National Park, and the website is homegrownnationalpark.org. Did you have anything else you wanted to talk about before you go?
Oh, I always like to stress that personal responsibility. It's not somebody else's job. It's everybody's job. And if you have no property and no balcony, no anything, you can vote, because how we vote is going to influence environmental policy tremendously. So that's a really important thing you can do.
Dr. Doug Tallamy, thanks for coming on the show.
You're welcome.